black woman.
Welcome to I'm Just Saying, two black women with opinions. The podcast where we have candid and powerful conversations with the women leading change. In this episode, we caught Vanessa Daniel on the Los Angeles leg of her Unrig the Game book tour, where she's traveling the country and having meaningful conversations with incredible women of color leaders about the impact of her work and the challenges we face. Vanessa is the former executive director of Groundswell Fund and has over 25 years of experience in social justice work, using her platform to build vibrant, intersectional grassroots movements. In this conversation with Jan, Vanessa shares her journey, the power of women of color in social justice, and how her book speaks to the challenges and victories we face today. Let's dive in.
Well, this book is about telling difficult truths, and I have had a lot of experience doing that in my life. The first time I had to tell a difficult truth was really, I'm from Seattle, Washington. I grew up there in the 80s and 90s as a queer, mixed race, half Sri Lankan, half white kid. And I grew up in a really tight-knit Sri Lankan family that was my entire world. And at the age of 5, the difficult truth I told was about sexual abuse. And the experience I had was that my entire Sri Lankan family set my mother and I adrift. And so I learned a hard lesson at 5 that, if you want to be free, you have to tell the truth. That sometimes it'll break your heart that people, you have to leave some people behind that want to stay in the lie. And that was very difficult. I went into a world with my mother that was a very predominantly white world, where, she really understood gender-based discrimination, but really had a lack of skill and a lack of will to address the racism that I was facing. And so that's what, through just my friends and black women who were their mothers, ended up being the people who taught me how to survive this country as a girl of color. From the time I was 5 till the time I left Seattle at 19, the only Sri Lankan people who I had ever seen were my family. So I didn't see myself reflected anywhere. So I had that acute experience of never having a context or a room that I walked into where people weren't asking me, where are you from or what are you mixed with? That experience of being an outsider, of having to explain yourself, validate yourself, I think informed a lot of my organizing. So it was, I think, black women who introduced me to movement and brought me into movement. And I think that my gravitation to grassroots organizing as a methodology, to really centering some of the most marginalized groups in society, whether it's Black women who received the larger share of funding out of every program Groundswell ran, or whether it's trans folks who I included in the mission from the very jump at the organization. Like that, I think, was really highly informed by having a deep empathy of what it feels like to be an outsider and wanting to create a world in which there's the highest form of belonging for everybody.
I love that. I love that word belonging too. So I'm like super pleased to be able to talk with you about your book, Unrig the Game.
Thank you so much for having me. Man, it's good to see you. It's been a long time.
But I'm still being seen around the joint. But anywho, I appreciated that the book was deeply personal, and it shared the story of how you got to where you are now and why the things you see so clearly and with such clarity. And also, what exposure to some real serious organizers you had too. So when I wanted to start the conversation, I wanted to start with looking at the organizing that you do as a parent, because I thought that was so cute. And it reminded me of the organizing I had to do as a parent. And I would think that, here we are in 2025, that we wouldn't have to do that. That our schools would be more inclusive and collective of the the diversity of families and that type of family.
Yeah.
Huh. Just like you would think when you were 5-year-old in Seattle, that Seattle was much more progressive than the story that you share about Seattle.
Yeah.
So it just continues to amaze me at the racism in this society. It just continues to amaze me. So I'm gonna talk to you, parent first, right? I have a daughter,
Yes.
and I sent her to an independent black school called Uhuru Shule. And it was all good at Uhuru Shule, but Uhuru Shule, eventually, she had to go to public school. I could have put her in private school, I suppose, but I put her in public school. And it was as if I had to go to school with her. And so I organized Black History Month celebrations and various other things, the Malcolm and Urey Day, because the school just didn't do it.
Yeah.
And you had to organize for your children too. Tell me about your children and organizing.
Well, I have a 13-year-old and a 6-year-old, both daughters. And when we had our first, my co-parent Trisha and I, in Oakland, California, which is, at the time, it may still be like the highest per capita of same-sex women households in the country. So our daughter just had absolutely no negative connotation with having two moms. Every classroom she was in, every camp, every after-school program, there were many, many families like ours. And it's also, Oakland is a predominantly people of color city. She had more anti-Blackness, my co-parent is Jamaican, anti-Blackness when she was in Oakland than she did homophobia. In fact, I remember the day she came home trying to comb her curls straight, saying that the kids wouldn't let her play Elsa on the playground. So this was in Oakland. And this is in a city that even in the most elite private schools in Oakland, they have units on the Black Panthers. So you can, yeah, but it's in the water we're swimming in, with just the media environment. But she has had so much community there to counterbalance that. When we moved to up to the Pacific Northwest, we moved to a town that was kind of adjacent to Tacoma, which we picked it because it was the most racially and economically diverse, and it had good public schools. And then when we got there, we realized the reason it was so diverse is it's a military town, so it was very socially conservative. So there she faced teasing, a lot of homophobia, a lot of anti-Blackness. And so she had to learn, and she is, my young one is pure fire. My eldest daughter is much more serene. She's very introspective, so she had to kind of learn how to get a thicker skin and to find her voice. For a while, she'd come home and say, yeah, Mom, and I said this and this and this. And I said, well, that's great. And I said, did you actually say that to him? And she said, I said it in my head. So, she had to learn how to navigate that outside of the bubble, which is what most of this country looks like. And then we had to advocate with the school board. We had to advocate. Trisha and I both went into the class, spent time in the class, taught units in the class. We were in the principal's office all year long. And, just had to be really, really engaged in order to make it a safe environment for our child.
So parents of color still need to go to school with their children.
Yeah.
That's the part that was like, made my heart go.
Especially when you're doing this work all day in social justice and then you have to go fight it at school.
At school.
It's a lot of work.
To make our children okay. To have nerve. But you had some wins. Family Day as opposed to taking out.
Yes, that was a daddy-daughter dance. And we organized to expand that to be Family Day. She came home crying that she couldn't go to the dance because she didn't have a daddy. But the thing that's such a great example of, I think, how women of color through, just expanding belonging for ourselves, expand belonging for everyone. Because when they changed that dance from the daddy-daughter dance to the family dance, there were kids in that school who didn't have a dad because it's a military town. Their fathers had died. There were kids who, their fathers were deployed, who were being raised by grandparents. So it made it a more inclusive environment for everyone. And yeah, our family went and she had a ball.
Yay. All righty. So that kind of leads me to these magical, wonderful entities called Black women and how we show up. We show up in school, and then we show up in, I believe you call them fixer-up organizations. I feel like it's more like burnt down, turned out organizations. Fixer-up sounds like too kind of a term for where Black women show up. Even if we think about where Kamala might have showed up in the U.S. as a president, it was a house on fire.
Absolutely. It was less time to mount a campaign than any other candidate.
Yeah.
So, yeah. And I do feel like as a half South Asian, half white woman, I do see, and I talk in the book about we are not a monolith, that there's like different ways that the powers that bench different folks based on their background. And there's different ways that people come for our necks, whether we're Black women or South Asian or Latina. And, but I do think, yeah, I mean, absolutely the mothering and mammying and how that's also tied to the glass cliff is very acute for Black women. And I saw the glass cliff with other women of color as well, with being invited into a house on fire. And, that there was a CEO, non-Black woman of color here in California who, invited in. The controller comes into her office a few weeks into the job, says there's not enough money in the bank to make payroll at the end of the month. No one had told her this before she took the position. She has to clean up the mess, knowing that if she doesn't, she's going to be the one that takes the fall for it. So I think we see that over and over again.
Let's define glass ceiling. What's a glass ceiling or glass cliff?
Glass cliff. Glass cliff is being invited into an organization in crisis. And it's where you either work your Black or brown girl magic to clean up the mess or you take the fall for what somebody else created. And it definitely looks like Kamala Harris being invited to mount a campaign with less time than any other candidate.
But it's even in the nonprofit industrial complex, right? When you said Black women are invited to an organization, to lead an organization when it is absolutely flailing or failing, type of thing. So in that regard, I'm going to get to that Black women's job description in a moment because it was like, oh my God, it was worse than other duties as necessary. But what questions do Black women need to ask before they accept that leadership position that really is leadership on that glass cliff?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really good for people to ask to see financials, ask to see the audit, ask to, look at 990s, get a real good understanding of all the different aspects of financial health, cash flow, reserves. What has the organization been able to pass a balanced budget each year? Has it passed a deficit? Is it authorized a deficit budget? Figure out all of those things so that you can really go eyes in open. And then, there are good organizations that go through rough spots and you may still decide to take the job, but it's with consent. And then you can also ask for the resources because there's a lot of times in crisis where women of color are actually excellent leaders in crisis. We were excellent leaders in the crisis of 2020. That's why we didn't end up with Trump as a president. And we are excellent. We're going to be excellent leaders in this moment. But inviting people into a crisis without the proper resources or supports, and with all of the roadblocks thrown up in their way, is where the problem comes in, and without the transparency.
Pause quickly.
Yeah.
Someone's blocked in the Maisha needs your key so she can.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. We can use mine.
so I thought about that, and I also think about, some of those barriers are board and funders, in terms of when funders um, decide, ooh, this is an organization in crisis with new leadership. Let's give them half the money.
Absolutely.
Or they have a board that is um, very much loyal to an outgoing leader
Yeah.
and so resistant to any type of change or
Yeah.
shift that new income leader wants to make. And then I see also, and I'll give the example of Planned Parenthood, where you see a Black woman in leadership, but she's surrounded by a force field, white board members and white C executive staff. And it's not only that particular organization, but then sometimes that happens and that magic kind of like refuses to work because it's locked in.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that's what I've been noting in the field.
Mm-hmm.
Noting in the field.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we have to acknowledge some of the nuances and differences between, women of color who founded their organizations and were able to build it from the ground up, women of color who took over for maybe a man of color and it was majority people of color staff, versus also taking over and being like the first person of color or the first woman of color to be like a CEO following, 100 years of white leadership.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that there is different levels, degrees of difficulty in different ways to those positions. So, for example, taking over a historically white organization, there has to be some grace for those leaders and support around those leaders to be able to pivot that. I think a lot of times this happens when we get our folks into elected office too. It's like we get them, we support them to get into the power position. Then once they're in there, if they can't turn what is a very toxic, difficult environment to be accountable to us right away and our communities, then we just throw stones from the outside in the way that we used to do. When the institutions were run. Huh?
Or we desert
them. Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's figuring out, I mean, absolutely people should still be accountable, but there needs to be an understanding of what they're up against, what their intent is, how much effort they're putting in, and there needs to be support for those leaders as well.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, I have seen that a lot, and it is our Mayor Karen Bass in Los Angeles.
Yeah.
That was one of the things she said, that when she got into office, that whole grassroots movement that had worked diligently to get her into office disappeared.
Yeah.
They didn't walk the halls with her. They didn't show up in the spaces where that voice was needed to be heard, to be continued to right that ship.
Yeah.
And that especially is around budget, right? Because sometimes that budget is in place long before that person gets there, and those commitments are made with the budget.
Yeah.
Type of thing.
And that's a story you hear over and over again from women of color, electeds, of kind of being left in the wind. And it also, I think, speaks to the discomfort that we have on the left with power. We haven't really reckoned with it. It's why we don't fully step into the power to govern. It's why we tend to fetishize sometimes only the smaller or scrappier efforts, and when things scale or when people get into higher levels of power, sometimes we mistrust it, we tear it all down. And accountability is one thing, but having just a fundamental discomfort with power is not useful when our folks are getting in there and then feeling abandoned and left in the wind.
Okay.
Yeah,
that's true. We I don't know. It feels like a love-hate relationship with power in terms of how we do it and how we want to be perceived. And you're talking about this from a woman's perspective, in terms of we want to be nice, not the bitch, right? But sometimes you just gotta be that bitch. Got one. But then you still want to look at yourself in the mirror and be the kind, gentle person that you used to be before you had to assume that part, So how do you strike that
well, it's
balance?
also like this, and this is what I kept coming up again and again in the book, is like this narrow space where you're walking a tightrope between, being just nice and pliant and just, appeasing to everybody, which, doesn't actually make you an effective leader, because you have to be decisive and you have to have boundaries. And, or, like this perception that, because you're assertive, this perception that you're mean. And, I talk about the top 5 barriers in the book that bench us. And number 1 is the glass cliff, which we've addressed. Number 2 is this assumption of incompetence. Number 3 is the expectation to mother and mammy. 4 is being given 0 to no margin for error. And then 5 is being abandoned when you're attacked. But this expectation to mother and mammy speaks to what we're talking about right now, because this is the being cast as mean or aggressive for normal levels of assertiveness that would be accepted from any other leader. Okay. It is, being told you're cold or mean anytime you say no. It is the demand that you not just create a workplace that's sustainable or fair, but that's utopian, where nobody ever feels a trigger or an ouch or a discomfort. And then the punishment that's often meted out in the public square when you don't deliver on that impossibility. It is the demand that you kind of perform this type of vulnerability so that people feel less uncomfortable with the specter of a woman of color who's just fully standing in her power. All of those things, navigating the space of being perceived as nice enough where people won't annihilate you and you can actually get the work done, is such a narrow space. And it is, I talk about the book Whistling Vivaldi by Plata and Steele, which is such a great book.
Yeah.
But he talks about stereotype threat and all the ways that we contort ourselves based on stereotype threat, to be able to kind of keep ourselves from being safe and from being annihilated. And I think that the acrobatics that women of color have to do in order to maintain enough space to make decisions that any good leader has to make, to execute a vision and to even collaborate well, is just way too tight. And that's part of why I wrote this book. We need to expand that space so that people's full brilliance can come through and they can, bring that through to their teens.
We'll talk about the abandonment also, since we talk about abandonment.
Yeah. Well, abandonment when attacked. And this is, one of the ways this looks is what happened to the original leaders of the Women's March. So there were 4 of them, but only the 3 who were women of color were targeted by the NRA for attack ads. And based on those ads, people threatened their lives. It was very extremely stressful. People had to get security on their homes. Then they were dragged all over the internet behind these false rumors and accusations. And when they reached out to people in movement, people wouldn't return their calls. They said people treated us like we were guilty or radioactive or hysterical. And, then a year later, the New York Times broke the story that it was Russian bots that were behind all the trolling. And, this effort to cleave the women's movement, which in many ways, because of the bystanderism of the left, was successful during that period of time. And so I heard story after story of attack, and then without evidence, people moving away and abandoning people. And, as human beings, we are hardwired to have a visceral terror of being left out on the hill to die. So it really deeply affects human beings to have that experience, and particularly for people who have given their whole life to the movement. I talked to folks who had checked themselves into inpatient treatment centers for PTSD. I talked to folks who had struggled with suicidal ideation. It was really,
That's really tough.
really, really painful to hear the stories. And there's this quote by the feminist author Carolyn Jess Cook that I kept thinking of when I was hearing these stories, which is, why were we taught to fear the witches and not the people who burned them alive? So these kind of things need to get removed from movement spaces. And
How do we do that? How do we do that?
Yeah.
Because I see it happening on a regular and continuous basis.
Yeah.
Not the extreme that you were talking about, though I can easily imagine it, right? Just in terms of the folks I saw who were like, is she going to speak to me? Yes, I'm going to speak to you. Yes, we know each other. What is going on?
Yeah.
And I remember once walking into a room, and literally all I did was walk in the room. And it was this whole thing about the angry Black woman. And I was like, but I haven't even said anything.
Yeah.
I just walked in the room.
Yeah.
Right. So that's why I can easily imagine that and have witnessed that also in terms of how people came and actually smiled in your face and let me hear your side. And then when it came to the public court, crickets. Crickets. How do we solve that issue? Because I see some of the crickets being driven by fear.
Yeah.
Like, I don't want to be that person.
Yes.
Right? Or I don't want to risk my eye for
That's right. That's right.
So I'm just like, oh, how do we get around that? How do we round up the raven so it faces out as opposed to in type of thing?
Yeah. Well, so much of what we need to be doing right now is walking skillfully with our fear. There is so much fear. It's electric in our society right now between the climate disasters and, the rise of fascism and, the environment is just filled with it. And so we need to practice the muscle of how to walk with fear while keeping the force of our integrity, keeping our backbone, keeping our courage, keeping our voice and ability to speak up, keeping our powers of critical thinking and discernment, where we really lean into a value of rigor, where you are actually examining evidence and not just jumping to conclusions. This thing that we keep doing on the left of allowing people to crusade against other folks with no evidence, just in a mob mentality, is incredibly corrosive, not just to, the individual that it's happening to or the organization that it's happening to, but it is corrosive to our souls and our spirits and our strength. And you know what? What then separates us for the people following QAnon or the people saying that it's trans kids and immigrants are the reason for their economic pain? What separates us? We are teaching our own people to be sheep and to abandon the powers of their discernment and critical thinking. And that tills the soil for fascism. So, one of the most important muscles we need in facing a fascist threat is the ability to walk with courage through fear. And we need to be, the way we have discipline in moments when people are swirling and swarming in a cloud of fear, discipline looks like intervening. And it is tough to intervene and it's scary to intervene because no one wants the mob to turn on them. But if we don't, what is different than us sitting on our hands while the Gestapo takes our neighbors out of their homes?
Sure, because next time it'll be for you and no one will intervene.
That's right.
Yeah. I want to ask you one question. Well, two questions.
Okay.
That's right. I am thinking about the 92% of Black women who voted a moral, courageous vote in the last election.
Yeah.
And now we're getting two messages. One is, you know what, I'm going to mind my business and drink my water. I'm going to rest. Let the country burn down. Right? But then we get also a message like from Stacey Abrams who said, people, it would be nice. But if it burns down, we in the house.
That's right.
So where are we with that? How do you do that? How do you balance all? Okay.
Yeah.
We tried and here we are.
I can't speak for Black women for sure, but I will say that one of the voices that I look to, Malkia Devish Cyril, who I think is one of the great thinkers and writers of our time, they shared a post with, that meme that's been going around with Black women sitting on top of its building.
So on top of the building, what burn and that and their
And Malkia, who is the daughter of a Black Panther and who has, been in the movement from birth, their sentiment was this whole image and the sentiment that goes with it is a fascist dream.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't disagree with that. I think that it is right and just for Black women to be angry and to be tired. I fully understand that, particularly when the level of political and moral clarity has just been unparalleled by any other group in this country. And Black women have been the backbone of nearly every movement in this country. So the exhaustion, the rage at, folks who may not have stepped up or who did not step up is real. And I think is, to be acknowledged and validated. I think people do need to take the rest that they need to, because a lot of folks are tired and people are suffering health impacts from the level with which they have been working for social justice. So take care. We all need to take care of ourselves in these times. But the notion that is quite neoliberal and individualistic and actually much more grounded in kind of a consumer self-help economy and mindset, rather than like a deep history of, my understanding at least, of Black resistance, is like that's exemplified in that meme, I think is very dangerous. I don't think that we can, and none of us can afford to take our hand off the wheel at this point. And everyone has to figure out what energy they have left to engage. There is a sort of, I was in I co-chair the board of the National LGBTQ Task Force, and we had a brilliant session with Miss Major. And there was a very young person who came up and said, well, Miss Major, I just feel so tired and burned out. And Miss Major, who, if you know Miss Major, it's like she has been in ANCA. She has been through, she said, baby, go take a nap and come back when, So I do think it's like we need to look a little bit at this overcorrection that's happened between like when I came into movement in the early 2000s and what we've overcorrected to now. It used to be we focus too much on the external, and the internal workplace is totally unsustainable. Now it's like this navel gazing about the internal environment, and is it a utopia while the external work atrophies. Used to be that, we, didn't even have health insurance, which wasn't good. And now people are expecting workplaces and movement spaces to deliver them from all of their trauma and to heal everything. Ooh. And this is just not, what I appreciate about women of color is that we were not served by the old model. We're not trying to get back to the good old days because they were never good for us. But we are also getting killed by what's happening now. Because if you were already under the expectation to mother and mammy, and now you have to deliver utopia, that is a really crushing weight. So I think driving towards, what does it look like to come back to our core values? Linda Burnham talks a lot about what are our core values, not just the GLID mission statements that are on our organizational web pages, but do we value non-dominance? Is that what we're fighting for? Or are we actually just fighting for the right to get a turn and dominate others? Do we value rigor in our work and in looking at evidence and data and all of those things? Like, do we value that? Or are we just using that when it's convenient, and then when it doesn't serve our purpose, we're going to have a swarm without any facts or data? Do we really hold ourselves primarily accountable to the communities we're serving? That's a certain center of gravity. Or are we confused about like the workplace comfort level being the entire moral to the story? Like we need to get clear on what some of these values are in order to do the work that we have to do today. I'm, as a mother, and I know you don't have to be a mother to feel this, certainly, but I just feel a very high level of accountability too. Like there's nobody that's coming to save us.
Nobody's gonna.
So, we're going to do what we had to do, just as our ancestors did what they had to do so that we could be sitting here today.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, one of the reasons why I wanted to start with that parent thing, because that's who we're passing the baton to. And that's when my accountability comes in, like, oh, I was supposed to make the world a better place.
Yes.
So at least I can do now is hold some ground.
Yeah.
Hold some ground. Hold some ground.
We got to leave these positions less broken than we found them.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So, last question. What's on the horizon? What's the hopeful thing that you are looking for with the book and for our movement?
Yeah. Well, I'm seeing this book as an organizing tool. I'm devoting the year to helping seed as many conversations as possible about this. My dream is that, one day there's never a room or an organization or a space that a woman of color leader is in where someone is really trying to bench her unfairly, where there isn't someone who has enough knowledge and will to intervene. And I think it doesn't take sometimes but one person in a room to be able to intervene. And so I think that this conversation is just an important place to start. And that's my vision, so that we can actually go on and use our superpowers, which we didn't totally get to discussing, but 360 vision, boldness, and generosity, dealing with forces of race, class, gender, colonialism, simultaneously fighting for the bold things that our communities really deserve, and then fighting in a way that doesn't leave people behind, so that we can really bring those through, because those are so critical, particularly in this moment.
Okay, so we're going to make those caves real on that horizon. So we won't have to use so much of our superpower, that it'll just be the water we swim in.
Yes. We're dreaming it. People have dreamed other things that didn't exist into being. Shop women have dreamed this into being.
And I think about Ruha Benjamin when she says, we live in second wants his dream.
That's right.
And we have to create, with our own imagination and vision, what we want to be, and then plant the seeds for us to go to.
Yes. I just saw her, and she was remembering Dr. King and the integrating into a burning house. We need to envision what the house looks like.
Yeah.
We need to create our own beautiful.
Encourage the house with the yard and
healthy food,
the garden growing. Yes, all like that. And I just actually came back from Reproductive Justice Futures. Loretta.
Yeah.
Loretta J. Ross.
Yes.
And her book is Call It In.
Yes.
Right? And how do we begin to calling people as opposed to call out, isolate, attack, that type of thing. So we're getting these reinforcements to call in.
Yeah.
And to really think about, how do we move forward with our imagination and our vision? How do we reclaim our joy?
Yeah.
And take that to create the horizons that we want to see.
Absolutely. Yeah. Loretta, I had the privilege of interviewing her for this book too. So it's really nice that her wisdom is showing up in so many places right now. We need every generation's wisdom right now.
We do. We need this book. We need to talk about the superpowers in terms of the generosity, the love, the boldness, and I want to say courageousness, and that 360 vision, as well as to know those forces against us. The mother and the mammy. We used to say it was 4 M's, and I can't think of what that is. You need to be Madonna, the mother, the mammy, and the sex toy too.
Yeah,
you could be all of that in one. And how those things work against us, especially as that narrow lane that we sometimes find ourselves in.
Yeah. I appreciate you. I appreciate you. It's so good to see you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for coming. Yay. So I will push it out. We'll have some discussions. There's a whole bunch of Black women on the other side of that door we can get this book to.
Okay, great.
Thank you for tuning in to today's episode of I'm Just Saying, 2 Black women with opinions. Be sure to follow, share, and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts so you never miss an episode. To learn more about Vanessa Daniel and her work, check out her book, Unrig the Game, and follow the link in the show notes. Stay connected and keep pushing for a world where we all thrive. See you next time.